can see my screen. You should see data security update, advocacy in Washington. If someone could, in the questions box, just shoot me a quick message. Perfect. Thank you. You guys can see my screen. Okay, Phil, all you.
Thanks. I appreciate it, Carl. Welcome to the December edition of the Conexus webinar series, Data Security Update, Advocacy in Washington. Before we get started, I have a quick word from our sponsor, which is Conexus. Conexus is a technology arm of NACS, formerly known as PCATS, the Petroleum Convenience Alliance for Technology Standards, but we've changed the name in great part because we're not just a standards organization anymore. We also provide education and advocacy to the industry on technology issues. I'd like to put a special pitch in for the Data Security Committee, who is the specific sponsor for this particular webinar. Please come out and join us. You can go out to the Conexus webpage and sign up for groups if you're a member of Conexus. Sign up for the Data Security Committee if you're not a member of that committee, and come on out and spend some time with us. Love to have you come out and get active with us. One other pitch, the Conexus Annual Conference will be April 26th through 30th of 2015 at the Lowe's Annapolis Hotel in Annapolis, Maryland. A couple of housekeeping things. If you have questions, please type them into the questions box on your screen, and we'll get to those after the presentation. And also, there will be a survey invitation sent out to you at the end of the presentation. If you answer that, you'll get accelerated access to the presentation deck for this webinar. I also appreciate it if you could suggest some future topics with us, as well as tell us how we can do a better job with our webinars. We have some future webinars already on the agenda. The next one, which will be in January, is on EMV in the forecourt. That'll be the 24th of January.
22nd.
22nd, I'm sorry, the 22nd of January. Wrote that down wrong. In February, we'll have a deep dive into EMV, and in March, we have a presentation on PCI DSS 3.0. Today's topic, though, is advocacy in Washington as it regards data security, and we have a great panel of speakers today. Doug Cantor is the NACS legal counsel from Steptoe & Johnson. We have Paige Anderson, the director Government Relations for the National Association of Convenience Stores, and Gray Taylor, the Executive Director for Conexus and a consultant to NACS on issues regarding payments. With no further ado, I'm going to turn over the webinar to our speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar. This is Gray Taylor with Conexus and NACS. I wanted to preamble the presentation you're about to see to really dimension the importance of what you're about to hear. Conexus traditionally talks about how mandates, standards coming from the card companies are best implemented within our ecosystem. We're either doing it through the EPS committee, which Sharon Scase chairs, and they're taking the various data standards that we need to support and the data processes that we need to support to have an efficient payment system within our locations. Even though we do this, we know that we have data breach liability. And anybody who has read a paper in the last year has seen that this has been the year of the data breach. This has been the year where retailers have been punked repeatedly by cyber criminals from overseas primarily. There's a lot of technical things that Phil's group has worked on, all the way from PCI, boiling it down from a science project to 8 simple steps to risk mitigation, to advocating to the PCI committees and council as to the realities of our locations. What you're going to hear today is a different take on this because this has become such a huge issue within society that people in Washington, D.C. are taking notice. And as many of you will remember, whenever somebody takes notice in Washington, D.C., it's not always good news. So with that, I'd like to say that we can talk about standards and some of the external standards work that's being done in a Q&A, or we may put that into a future one. This is going to be about what's going on in Washington, D.C. with your government, with the regulators on data security. So with that, I'll give it to Doug Cantor.
Thanks. This is Doug Cantor. As Phil mentioned, I am counsel to NACS, and we have been working for NACS on card-related issues for many years now. NACS, as most of you probably know, helped found the Merchants Payments Coalition over a decade ago now, and we helped form that organization and have been counsel to that organization as well as NACS ever since. And over time, our experience and familiarity with these issues relating to not only the cards and the fees, but how the system operates and the security aspect has had to grow to keep up with everything that the card networks are doing to us, for us. You can decide how they do it. But that's my quick background. Let me let Paige introduce herself as well.
Hi, my name is Paige Anderson. I'm the Director of Government Relations at NACS. One of my issues in my portfolio is data security and cybersecurity. I've been with NACS for 2 years as of Monday. Before that, I was on Capitol Hill for 20 years, worked for 6 different members of Congress, and was also a staffer on the Energy and Commerce Committee. Sort of my last duties before joining NACS was trying to help the Energy and Commerce Committee write data security legislation, which became very complicated very quickly. And seeing all the different players, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of the playing field. And so my role in NACS is really being able to sort of be a liaison and connect, our smart folks who have to do, with our retailers who have to deal with these data breaches day in and day out, and try and use that information and translate it to the policymakers here in Washington, D.C. who don't necessarily understand how to run a business and how much of an impact what they do can affect your businesses.
So with that, who does them and why?
Education problem with a lot of the policymakers. They assume somebody's trying to get
in order
to get in the system that information has been taken, and that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and so we separate out the problems of foreign state actors, of corporate espionage, et cetera, as you see on the slide, in order to then bring people down to, well, what is it that we care about as merchants? When somebody's attacking our systems, what are they doing? And obviously the vast majority of the time, they're after payment card data. And they're after it because the payment card data, particularly here in the United States, is more vulnerable than it is in the rest of the world. And it is helpful to point out what some policymakers are beginning to recognize and others not as much yet, that these are very sophisticated attacks now, brought about by often organized crime, and this isn't, street-level organized crime. This is organized crime where people have the resources to get the most up-to-date equipment and spend long periods of time concentrating on particular targets to steal data, and that is a very difficult cross-border problem, but that's what we try to point people to. This problem is compounded by the way the issue's been portrayed in the press. Unfortunately, and really we're just about a year into a sea change in this issue publicly and in the minds of policymakers, because with the Target breach last year, all of a sudden, the focus became that a data breach is a merchant problem, that's where the breaches happen. That's why this issue is something that people should worry about. And I really think there was a combination of things that did that. One was just the press around that incident itself. It was new in a lot of ways. People hadn't been paying attention to this. It was news around the holidays. People were shopping. They were thinking about all this sort of thing. So it caught the popular imagination and attention at a time when there's not a lot of other news going on, and those stories can sometimes take off that way. And the last piece of this, which is very significant to our work and how we think through this issue, is the financial industry, banks and credit card networks, were incredibly pleased to see this opportunity and run with it and start blaming the whole world of data security on merchants. They saw their opportunity, and give them credit to the extent that you give credit for things like this. Questioning the ethics is a whole other issue, but the effectiveness of their government relations and public relations folks should not be questioned, because they did ride that wave and make sure that the world was blaming us for those problems.
So, and because this was in the news and the banks were able to take, this communications opportunity, the public became much more aware of it, but they also saw, firsthand, like, oh, somebody's using my card, I didn't make that payment. So the public was affected. They saw it firsthand, not just in the news, but in their statements, and the fact that they were getting phone calls, hey, did you know your card was used 400 miles away at a different store, but yet it was used, in your hometown. So they saw it firsthand. So what did they do? They contacted their member of Congress. Why aren't you doing something? So that sort of set the table between the news and the general public getting activated in the fact that they were bringing it up to their member of Congress, their senator. And so therefore we walked into January, February, where Congress like, geez, we've got to look at this. We've got to do something.
If you look at the polling on this issue right now, the public does believe, on the whole, that this is primarily a merchant problem. And there's lots of ways we'll talk about that we try to push back against that notion. But that notion's out there, and it's in the general public and in the minds of lawmakers. But one of the things we point to is some of the technology behind what's going on here. And we make the point consistently that the payment cards that the networks and banks have put out there are fraud prone. They have not done their job up front in protecting these products and in how they design these products. And so, for example, Europeans well ahead of us on chip and pin technology. 20 years old there, not really started here. That's part of what's made us vulnerable here. Everybody was stealing data in Europe said, it's harder to use. Let's go steal US data. Easier to use. Very simple. The pins in particular, we try to highlight with folks the effectiveness of using a pin and the fact that merchants, many of them, are ready to do that right now, and it could have a tremendous effect. That plays into some of the shortcomings of the way the networks are looking at this world right now. And the other pieces of technology that are out there, tokenization, encryption, et cetera, have not yet been utilized by the financial industry in the way that they could be or should be to really protect data, not only our brick and mortar type businesses, but thinking about internet businesses where much of the fraud is migrated in Europe and elsewhere. There are tools, but the financial industry has not stepped up to the plate to use those tools in the United States in the way that they have in other places and should here. We also need to point out, though, when you talk about technology, that there are obvious problems with that technology. If we go to the next slide. Obviously, EMV, as folks on this call know far better than we do, has problems in terms of how people can compete. It locks you into a proprietary technology owned by Visa and MasterCard. The card readers have that near-field communication technology, and Visa and MasterCard have incentivized the makers of that equipment to turn that NFC on and make it hard to turn off. They are looking with EMV and with some of these other technologies to take their monopoly position in the card world, in the physical card world, and transfer that over through data security measures and technology measures that are either inevitable because they push them, or pushed or mandated by law, so that they have that monopoly transferred into the mobile payments world. That's their strategy. It is very clear to us, and the more we point that out to policymakers, the better, but that is our responsibility in doing this, is to make sure they're aware of the consequences of some of these decisions they're making, and that things like EMV are owned by somebody. That, mandating that is like mandating Coca-Cola as opposed to other soft drinks that are out there on the marketplace.
The other disturbing part of this transition is not only are they forcing the monopoly, but they're not even trying to make that technology as safe as it can be. They're not requiring a PIN, which is, we've seen over and over, it's not a perfect solution to protecting our data, but it is one more layer that can be added. We don't have a seat at the table, an equal seat at the table when we look at tokenization, encryption standards, and other parts of this transition. And, but yet a lot of the burden of not only the transition costs that our retailers are going to have to pay, but if there is a breach or the liability that's going to incur, that's all going to shift, at the end of the day, into the retail merchant world.
That's exactly right. If you look at the other types of technology that are out there, there are problems with those too, obviously. Tokenization, because Visa and MasterCard are putting it out there in a way where they control the token, they control the system, this is another piece of the strategy. EMV is one strand. Tokenization is a strand. They need multiple ways, at least they think so, and they're certainly using them, to transfer that monopoly over to the mobile payments world, and tokenization is another one. It can be a revenue source for them. It really causes competitive problems, potential problems, if there isn't a way to open it up and make sure that other networks can compete, can act as those token service providers, and can make those systems operate.
I'd like to make a comment on this, because last week I was up at the Boston Federal Reserve, and we were going through, as part of the Mobile Payments Initiative work group, we were going through tokenization and its part in mobile payments going forward. And one of the things that dawned on me on this is that as we move into mobile, more innovative forms of payment, and even away from card-based payment, the network that we've all relied upon in the payment system, a Visa network, a Pulse network, the network is going to become less and less germane to payments, because networks were created in the 70s to allow many-to-many to communicate through a choke point where you could do accounting and servicing. Now we live in a world of many-to-many without having to go through that choke point. And one of the risks we run within tokenization is that this becomes a de facto network involvement of the card brands or whoever is the token service provider, so that regardless of where that transaction routes when you do a MasterCard transaction. You may cut a deal with JP Morgan Chase to do a retail transaction directly with them. If it has to go back to MasterCard to get a token issued at 8.5 cents, and all of your maintenance transactions, doing reference lookups and so forth, has to go back to that service provider, then in effect MasterCard has retained control of this new network, which isn't physical at all, but it's a logical network of token controls.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful and appreciate it. And that, getting policymakers who are making decisions to understand those things is difficult, but that's the hard slog that's going on now. And maybe with that we should take a look at the next slide and see just briefly what's going on the legislative front. Since that target breach last year, there have been more than a half-dozen hearings in different congressional committees on these issues.
House and Senate.
Yeah, both House and Senate, and look, there's been interest in doing something about it on a bipartisan basis. Democrats, Republicans, as Paige mentioned earlier, they all hear from constituents who say, hey, what are you doing about this? This is something that really crosses those lines and is a concern. Okay.
I was just saying, you know, one of the challenges that we have, that policymakers have on this issue, is because it is such a big issue and there are so many different players in the issue and so many different parts of keeping your personal information safe, that what you're finding is they're going to what they think is the low-hanging fruit, and you're seeing that most of the bills and, you know, the concepts that are talked about legislatively are mostly dealing after the fact. So how do you notify a customer if their, you know, information has been compromised? How do you go after these thieves? If you are able to get them, what kind of penalties are there? Liability issues. There are a couple of bills out there that look at before, and it's mostly revolving around information sharing. How can retailers and financial institutions and law enforcement and any other entity communicate and talk with each other and be able to share, hey, you know, here's the risk of what's happening. We are getting intelligence that these groups are committing these type of cyber crimes or potential, you know, you're at risk at this type of data breach. Here are things that you can do. And then once the breach occurs, how can you improve that communication? But you're really not looking at keeping the system, particularly the payment system, safer. And that's been a challenge we've had. Part of the problem is that the jurisdiction, and as you know, everybody's got to protect their turf in Washington, D.C., so whether it be at the agency level or the committee level, you have so many different committees that have a piece of this pie that getting a comprehensive bill that really looks at the entire issue to keep the whole platform safer is very, very complex.
Yeah, and as Paige said, that there are many of these bills developed before the target breach, and they were focusing on this notification issue. And the truth of the matter is, most of the folks sponsoring those bills and pushing them have really not absorbed what's happened in the last year and thought about it and adjusted their course accordingly. The response has been essentially to say, oh, this is a big issue now? I've already got something on that. Let's move that. But it doesn't quite fit what the world looks like at this point. And one of the biggest ways that it doesn't fit is with the exemptions. And both the banks and the telecommunications companies have for years fought very hard to make sure they are exempt from any data breach legislation that moves on the Hill. And they do use the jurisdiction that Paige pointed to as one excuse for that. But they also use other things, like the telecom companies, for example, like to go to the Hill and say, we just have these pipes. You know, they're dumb pipes. They don't know what's going on. Why should we be responsible for anything? Of course, they neglect to mention to the staff that all of their connections sending financial data around the country have software embedded in them and are hackable. And in fact, they've built in by law backdoors so that those systems can be hacked. Now they're supposed to do that by the law. That's called wiretapping, and law enforcement requires them to do it. But anybody who thinks law enforcement is the only people who could ever possibly exploit some of those backdoors is probably from one of those states that recently has legalized some of the substances that are talked about in the news so much. It just doesn't work that way. Again, though, this is a challenge. The banks, on the other hand, will say, wait, we're already subject to the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. You guys passed a long time ago. We have data security standards. We do all this good stuff already. It's just the merchants who are backwards and don't do what they're supposed to do. What's interesting is their standards under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act do not require any bank to ever notify a consumer of any data breach. It says that they should if they think there are certain risks, and obviously sometimes banks do that, but there's not a requirement. They get the discretion to decide. Again, what happens on the policy front, unfortunately, is that you've got a lot of people working on this who are not experts in this area, and they accept what their friends tell them at face value. And they'll repeat to us, oh, but they already have Gramm-Leach-Bliley. And they won't have any idea what Gramm-Leach-Bliley says or doesn't say, what it requires or doesn't require. The other piece of this that they really haven't thought through in any of these bills is, okay, notifying people based on a breach is one thing. Set aside for a moment who's covered, who's not covered. But what about security up front and actually dealing with the problem before it becomes a problem? And everybody will say reflexively, oh yeah, we want to do that. We want to make sure it's a problem before it's a problem. But Congress is incredibly bad at legislating technical requirements and standards like that. And so the answer so far in some of these bills has been, everybody has to do what's reasonable. They have to have reasonable data security standards. Well, we don't know what that means. Maybe folks on the call know what that means. But I'm really confident that most federal judges who the issue might come in front of have no idea what a reasonable data security standard is. And therefore, whether the technical people who work on this every day know or not, doesn't matter. The regulatory fallout and the legal fallout is going to be decided elsewhere. And that's a real problem. Not to mention the fact that we have the exemption problem there too. And the banks and telecom companies, again, aggressively say, we shouldn't be subject to that. We have to have reasonable standards. We've got Gramm-Leach-Bliley, or we just have dumb pipes. What the heck do we have to know? Or we would have to inspect every piece of data that goes over our system, the telecom companies say, if that was the case. It's all ridiculous, but it has so far actually managed to get them remarkable latitude with some of the people writing these pieces of legislation.
Well, and in addition to that, they claim, based on other pieces of legislation, that they are already being regulated by certain federal agencies, and they're making the argument that they don't want to have duplicative regulatory environments and two regulators on the same issue, when the reality is those regulators really aren't regulating on data security. And that's the other communications obstacle that we have in our way that we have to get around.
If we could guarantee that we had regulators on the merchant side at the federal level that would agree with everything we said with no basis for it, the way the banking regulators do for the banks, we would be asking for regulation. Just can't guarantee. Nobody owns their regulators quite the way the banks do. Good for them, not so good for us.
Well, the other part of the legislative pie is you have Congress, but then you also have the White House and the executive branch. And the executive branch has also had its moments of trying to get involved in this issue, which Doug has been really involved in.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Many of you may have seen the news in October when the president actually went to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and signed an executive order on this topic. There was a period of a couple of months leading up to that where the banks and networks thought this was the brass ring that they could grab. They thought they were going to get an executive order that required all federal agencies to take EMV, all federal agencies to get their employees EMV cards, and that this was going to turn the tide in a nice way for them to make it almost a de facto requirement more broadly than the federal space to do those things. We were lucky and worked hard at it, but we're lucky to get the ear of the folks in the White House working on this and make them understand some of those technology problems that we talked about earlier with EMV and the PIN versus signature problem. And in fact, when that buy secure executive order, it did talk about having cards with chips, but it did not talk about EMV. They made sure not to endorse any particular company's technology, and they made clear that they better have PINs. Now, how that works out in practice may be a more difficult thing, but in terms of feeding into the publicity problem that we pointed to up front, it was incredibly helpful, and we are aware from some of what goes on with the lobbying from the financial industry that they were really upset at how it ended up because they thought the announcement changed on them at the last minute, and to some extent it did. Part of that order requires a White House summit, which will be next year on these issues. And so there will be continued dangers here as well as some opportunities. But early in the next year, there should be some news on this, and we, along with others, will be front and center trying to make the pitch to the administration that the solutions on data security need to allow fulsome competition. Can't just lock in a proprietary product that somebody owns, and can't kill off the very significant innovation that's coming. When Gray talks about the many-to-many capability we have today, that is potentially revolutionary. And folks in the White House get that technology can be revolutionary, and they love those types of concepts. And we're stunned to learn that if you lock in Visa and MasterCard's ideas on data security, you'll kill lots of innovators out there trying to do these really interesting things that can avoid and make some of these networks obsolete or at least unnecessary. That's a big deal in terms of their thinking, and we need to make sure collectively that they keep that in mind, because that'll keep them on the right path. And with that, the next slide, there are some things along those lines that we emphasize, and we think to the extent that folks in our industry are talking to, whether it's members of Congress, staffers, folks in the administration, press, anybody who is potentially influential in this area, it really helps to change the conversation in certain ways. And from my perspective, one of those ways, first and foremost, is making clear that that a company, when they are breached, is a victim of a crime. And I saw there was a question about fault that was sent in, and I appreciate it. It's a really good question because there is a tendency to try to look very closely at a company's practices and say, hey, were they doing the right thing? Were they doing enough? And that's a legitimate series of questions, but it's, from my perspective, better not to assign fault here because we don't do that in other similar contexts. It's important to remember this is a crime. So, for example, if you had a business where somebody broke in the back door and stole things, it wouldn't be our first reaction to say, hey, did they have a good enough lock on the back door? Did they do what they were supposed to do? Is that company at fault? Our first reaction would be to say, that's awful. Somebody stole from them. That's a crime. And we should remind people that that ought to be the first reaction. And it's fair enough to say, you know, based on your neighborhood and what you got in the building, some better locks are out there. You might want to use that. But that's an altogether different thing than saying it was their fault if they didn't have the right lock or didn't have a lock at all. It is clear that we are in the crosshairs on some of this data security stuff, but that doesn't mean it's our fault if we're not able to prevent all of them.
You know, I'd like to weigh in on that one too, because there's a theory in security of all types, which is, you know, what promulgates the opportunity for the crime. And the parable I always like to look at is if you bought a car prior to 2000, you had a car radio that was just there, and you could have an alarm system on that car, but people just smash the windows and steal the car radio. Somewhere down the road, the car manufacturers got smart and RFID linked the car radio to the car. So if you remove the car radio, you no longer have a functional radio. Therefore, it has no value. So what they did is they said, we can't protect this any more than we are reasonably or even unreasonably, so let's take the value out of the object. And I would submit that, yeah, if we've got a company that is not changing their passwords from defaults, is not taking the proper care to lock out their system, then really what should be taken and should be really their own loss is corporate information. The fact that we've got card data that is absolutely unprotectable and is absolutely valuable in the cyberspace, especially in the card not present space, is what makes people jiggle the back door in the first place. And I will argue, and Target will bear out, that even though you do change passwords, even though you do take reasonable precautions to protect your data, what happens is there's always a hole in large enterprises. There's always a flaw. There's always something that's exploitable. And you just look at even our government agencies that have been breached in the last year. These are people who we thought were unhackable, and that really shows to me that you can't protect systems to the degree we need to. You need to start taking value out of the product.
I also think that as we look at every breach is completely different. It's unique. There's unique players, unique ways that they got into the system. And so because each system is unique and there are vulnerabilities in every part of that information flow, whether it's at the telco level, the financial level, or the merchant level, you know, that leads into the fact that everybody needs to have a seat at the table to actually discuss what the risk is, what the problem is, sharing the information, what is the problem, and together coming up with the solutions. And that's where having this bifurcated system of some are not regulated, some are regulated, is not going to do anything to promote security. Everybody has to be under the same umbrella.
And then along those lines, Paige, it seems like the pervasive mentality coming out of the financial services industry is it's not about how I fix the system, but it's how do I shift the liability. When we take a look at what the EMV liability shift, at least they were honest about the term. It's a liability shift. When you look at PCI, what it was is a vehicle by which to determine the culpability of the merchant getting breached. Even though Target was PCI compliant, nobody's ever PCI compliant after a breach. It's just the absolute tenet. And so really what it is how do we shift the liability rather than fix the problem? And I would argue that you've got a product that's out there that's unsafe. It's been out there, and it's almost like buying a car without seat belts and an airbag. Why would you do that? Well, both the car and the card were both designed in the 1970s. The cars have been upgraded. The cards have not.
Yeah, and that's another issue that I think is worth emphasizing here is in this area, part of the financial industry push for exemptions, regulation of merchants, exemptions for them, is they complain repeatedly that they cover all these fraud costs and have all these costs of reissuing cards, and it's all the merchants having these breaches. And you'll hear them repeat pieces of that over and over again in different forums. In fact, they even got their regulator, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, to repeat some of that in a Senate Banking Committee hearing where they were testifying this week. The problem with that, which we need to point out consistently is, and this is one of the, I think the fourth bullet on the reframing page, we pay for fraud, we pay for card reissuance, and in fact, we pay double, at least, for both. And the way we pay double is we pay upfront all of the bank's fraud costs and all of their card reissuance costs in the form of swipe fees. In fact, even under the Federal Reserve's debit rules, their measure for the part of the fee that is fraud is 5 basis points. Why is it 5 basis points? Well, when the Fed did their study, they determined that the average amount of fraud across all the covered banks was 5 basis points. So you know what? We're paying 100% of their fraud up front. That's number one. Then, of course, if we're the ones who have a breach, we pay for it again. And Visa and MasterCard have a measure of our increment above the standard amount of fraud that occurs even without a breach that merchants have to pay. So that's twice. We pay it up front and we pay it on the reimburse it on the back end. We pay for all their fraud twice. The same is true for card reissuance. In the Fed's rule on debit card fees, there's that 1 cent adjustment charged on every debit transaction for fraud prevention. What's fraud prevention? Well, among the things the Fed measured and provided reimbursement for, or upfront payment, as the case actually is the cost of reissuing cards. So we've paid for that upfront. And again, Visa and MasterCard have a schedule on the back end. If we are the ones who have a breach, we pay for reissuing the cards. Now, there's obviously no reciprocal responsibility. Visa and MasterCard do not have a rule that says if the banks have a breach, all the chargebacks on those accounts, that bank has to reimburse the merchants. Doesn't happen. I'm sure all of you are still waiting for the first check to reimburse you for those chargeback transactions. It's not coming, unfortunately. But those are things that people who make policy in this area don't understand and need to understand because, again, that's the excuse for saying regulate them, not us. The banks will say, we have a financial incentive to really do well here because we pay all the fraud. They don't. All those things are wrong, and so this is just a really important piece of what's going on the policy front is making people understand what the world really looks like, not the world as the banks describe it. And then we already talked about covering everyone, but making sure it's competitive too, shining a light on the attempt to move the monopoly into mobile payments is key, and shining a light on how they can inadvertently do that with policy by mandating things or cutting off innovation. That is really important here as well. So that reframing of the issue we can't emphasize enough, and it's what we spend our time doing. And you get a lot of people whose mouths hang open for a bit when you say this stuff and say, I had no idea that that was going on. And in fact, they'll ask for all kinds of backup. Wait, are you sure? Because the banks told me something completely different. So just a little insight into Paige's world and mine. But with that, maybe we should go to the next step slide and talk from there. And first and foremost, I'll emphasize that we need your help to keep doing this stuff. We need to know how well things work and don't work for you, what you're working on in this area, what are the concerns to you, and we need you talking it up in the same way we talked about.
You know, as lobbyists, you know, while we have very good relationships and we can get in the door and we'll talk with staff, we'll talk to different members, we have our relationships, but the reality is the relationship that's strongest is between the congressman and his constituents, and you all are constituents. So we can help you provide the tools to get comfortable to talk with your member of Congress or your senator, and if you have an interest in doing that, please reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to help you make that connection and introduction with your member of Congress, because they really do need to hear from you. But you know, as Doug and I look at the issues and we frame the issue and we look at the communications package, the most effective way to communicate with a member of Congress is not only having it come from the constituent, but being able to share specific stories of directly how it's affecting your businesses. And you all have that experience. You know how much time and resources and money you're spending to protect your systems. You know how many times you've been breached and how much these thieves are costing you. You have to comply. There are 48 out of 50 states that already have data breach notification and data security laws on the books. You know, how easy or hard is it to comply? What works for you all? What does not work? Because, you know, there's no such thing as a new idea in Washington. They go finding different laws and regulations already going on at states and local communities. Sometimes they'll find a good model, and sometimes they'll find a bad model. So if you're operating, you know, in a state that has a pretty fair, good system, you know, that kind of information would be helpful for us to know.
Yeah, it may be helpful to have a federal law that preempts the states based on it incorporating a good state model. On the other hand, what we've seen consistently over the past year is bad ideas that while they would preempt the states, they would, by regulating merchants and exempting telecom companies and banks, point the finger of data breach at us. And just to give a little more detail on that, some of the draft bills we've seen out there over time would exempt everyone else in the payments chain who touches payment card data except the merchant. And in fact would make the merchant responsible for informing the public and their customers of data breaches, even if somebody else had the data breach. That's actually something that folks in California are discussing right now, unfortunately, but it's something that the congressional staff was looking at. Now, they didn't realize their bill would play out that way. I think that was inadvertent. But if you have the Federal Trade Commission regulating merchants on this, and merchants are subject to the law, and the other guys are exempt, well, if there's a breach anywhere, what's going to happen?
They're going to go to the entity that falls under their jurisdiction.
That's right. There's only one place to enforce. Well, you know, that must be a nail, and I have a hammer and only a hammer. So those types of problems can crop up in this area. But as Paige said, the more we know about what can work well, what does work well from your perspective, the better. And with that, maybe we should stop and see if there are other questions that we've missed along the way, or if people want to put in. Oh, cryptocurrencies. The answer is yes, regulators are looking at cryptocurrencies. I think they don't yet have enough knowledge to know what they don't know about the cryptocurrencies. Actually, the most active regulator by far has been New York, their Department of Financial Services, and they've proposed some regulations in New York. The federal regulators are behind, and they are very interested, but they don't yet know, at least as what I see from them, they don't yet know how they want to approach it and how to think about it, other than the IRS ruling that said these aren't currencies at all. These are commodities, essentially, investment. Now, I think that view may change over time. Some of it was driven by the kind of trading volatility of Bitcoin as opposed to other cryptocurrencies. But yeah, so a lot of interest, but not well-formed or well-developed thoughts as of yet.
I've got a question. Because we do have 48 states that do have their own legislation, some of it very bizarre, some of it very beneficial, where they essentially have said if you're PCI compliant, you're off the hook, as they did in Oregon. But it seems to me that we got a couple of problems here. One is, where did the breach occur? If you're a multi-state retailer, which state laws do you have to comply with? Do you have to, if you have a system-wide breach in 4 states, do you have 4 compliance jurisdictions you've got to live up with? So it seems to me that this is something that's like communications. It almost needs to reside in the federal level for any level of consistency. What do you think is what do you think are the chances of us getting a level playing field bill introduced and passed anytime soon at the federal level?
Go ahead.
I don't see how, unless you have leadership bringing all of these multiple committees together and looking at it holistically, I think it will be very difficult to do, which is why I think they'll do a piecemeal approach, and they're going to look at the low-hanging fruit. I think the best chance of a data security bill becoming law this coming Congress is going to just probably focus on information sharing. I think there's a lot of bipartisan support on that, and there's been a lot of work in that area already where they've worked with companies, so a lot of the liability issues have been worked out, so I could see that moving forward. Then the next potential bill that will try to go forward is probably going to focus on data breach notification, but what we're hearing on the House side from committee staff is the exemptions are still in the bill, and it'll be difficult removing them.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that we're at something of a standoff on those bills beyond the information sharing piece, where the big players like banks and telecoms want exemptions. We don't want exemptions, and obviously there's disagreements on other aspects of those things, and so it's likely to mean ultimately no legislation. That could change. Both sides, frankly, to fight that fight, will put out some proposals that make the other side go crazy, both in terms of the banks trying to regulate the merchants more stringently, and we will probably put out some things that drive the banks crazy in order to make sure we don't lose that standoff. But that's the most likely scenario as a standoff. There's
also one more, it can be an obstacle or it can be an opportunity depending upon how you look at it. On the House side, there is a subcommittee in the House Energy and Commerce Committee that has jurisdiction over data breach notification and data security, and they have a new chairman. So there is a new opportunity to educate that member of Congress, Mike Burgess from Texas. You also have in the Senate side that there has been a power shift, so you will have new chairman, new subcommittee chairman. So there are new opportunities to educate members. There's over 75 new members of Congress and senators that are going to be sworn in on Tuesday, December 6th. That's certainly another education opportunity, and we have a few folks that we've been working with that we may have some champions to work on some of these issues, but even an easy bill is very complicated to become law, and this one is not easy by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and another question that came up was about privacy legislation and personally identifiable information. Congress has struggled with that for over a decade and has never been able to pass that type of legislation, in part, again, because Congress is not well equipped to keep up with the current state of technology. Every time they get in their minds what they're trying to regulate and what it looks like, by the time they put that in a bill and move it forward, the technology's changed,
right,
and their basic mental constructs are no longer good at describing what's happening in the world. And so I think that I don't think privacy legislation is going to happen anytime soon. I think it's going to be like the last decade, where there are news stories that cause hearings and attention and pieces of legislation, and things ramp up, and then as folks realize how complicated and difficult it is, it slowly dissipates and gets ready for the next time that there's some hysteria around the
issue. It was
issue.
privacy issues that blew up the last true markup on data security legislation 3-4 years ago, because defining what is truly, personally identifiable information is complicated. Is it just your name and address? Is it your birthday? Is it your social security number? Is it a credit card number? Is it your zip code? California, was trying to claim that just putting a zip code was that information, and that became complicated. So how you define that really is.
So in the absence of anything that's well-defined coming out of Congress, we're left with the Federal Trade Commission that is interpreting what PII is, and
yep.
and our experience has been it's getting more broadly and broadly defined.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's not something we'll be able to stop. The FTC's tentacles continue to grow on many fronts, but this is certainly one of them, and they define it case by case. Another question that was up there was about EMV and whether folks in Congress understand that the EMV upgrade or shift can't happen in the time frames laid out by the card networks. And I would say that the answer in most offices to that is no, they don't. We've been talking about that, and so more of them recognize that than used to. But overall, no, they have no clue what the financial and technical requirements are. They have no clue how few companies there are making the equipment that's needed to do the upgrades, and the type of effort it would take to change out all of this stuff by the deadline. So some of them do. It's definitely something we talk about, but overall they don't really have a good grasp of that. They also, I think, there's a knee-jerk reaction that we have to really massage and work through to get people to stop doing that, is to say, oh, this is a problem. Okay, there's this, EMV thing. Everybody should do that. That's the quick, easy reaction members of Congress tend to have, and so having them recognize the world is more complicated than that is helpful, but they're definitely not all there yet.
Along those lines, my experience is that people in Washington like Disney solutions. In other words, wave a magic wand, and EMV has become that magic wand. And it became a magic wand after the Target breach in the middle of January last year. I can tell you that there are some very intelligent, otherwise intelligent regulators who should know better, who still believe that our industry is prepared to be EMV compliant. So it's no easy task. Even when you know that somebody understands what EMV is and understands the ramifications of implementing EMV, their assumption, unless you spend a lot of time explaining why, is that the petroleum industry is going to be right there on October 2017. And that's the kumbaya that the cards have been selling in Washington, D.C. What gets ignored is the fact that we still don't have a specification that includes Durbin routing. What we don't have is we don't have the ability to go in certification. what we also don't have is a common criteria certification. So we've got hundreds of certifications to go through between now and then. And then even if we did have a product today, we don't have enough technicians in the field to install these things, and 800,000 dispensers at a cost of $3.5 billion that the consumers are going to pay for. So there's a lot of facts that get left off the table, as Doug, as you've heard today. It's selective truth-telling when the other side comes in. And our job really is to fill in the facts on the other side so that people can make logical decisions for a level playing field decisions.
Well, it's 1 o'clock, and we appreciate this hour that you've given us and given us the opportunity to share with you what's going on in Washington. Please know we're here to serve you, and if there's any questions you have or any way you'd like to get more involved and engaged, please let myself or Doug know. We welcome some more partners in this fight here in Washington. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity.
And one thing I'd like to add is I understand a Day in the Hill this March.
Yes, the first week of March, March 2nd through 4th, is our Government Relations Conference, and data security will be our 3 priority issues we are going to be going on Capitol Hill to talk about, and we would welcome your participation in coming out here and helping us with that.
This afternoon, you'll be getting an email with a short 4-question survey. Once you complete the survey, you'll be given a link to this presentation, which will include all contact information for everybody involved on the call. And we thank you for your participation.